Welcome everyone. I'm Manisha Dutta. I'm professor and Lansdowne chair at the Faculty of Law. I'd like to start off by acknowledging with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Of course, as part of that multi-species orientation of many indigenous societies, I also like to recognize the animal inhabitants as well, some of whom are also not with us today. If you haven't already, please fill your plate and make your way to your seat so we will begin our lecture. The buffet lunch, in the spirit of animal law and policy, is completely vegan and plant-based, and among other things also reflects UVic's recent climate policy commitments to lower our food system emissions. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the annual lecture in Animal Rights Law and Policy. Now in its third year, the lecture series addresses the growing attention to animals and multi-species communities in societies. Unique among Canadian universities, this annual lecture has featured international guest speakers from among the global leaders in animal law. It's a real pleasure also to welcome today our speaker, Justin Marceau, to the University of Victoria to deliver the third annual lecture under the title Carceral Logics and Animal Law. This event is sponsored by the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy and hosted and integrated into the Faculty of Law Speaker Series. Justin Marceau is professor at the University of Denver, Sturm College of Law, where he also holds the Brooks Institute Faculty Scholar Chair of Animal Law and Policy and serves as a faculty director of the Animal Law Program. Professor Marceau has published leading articles in the fields of criminal law and animal law and served as an expert witness in both disciplines. He has published more than 50 academic articles and is an author of 2 U.S. casebooks, one on the death penalty and one on habeas corpus. He is the author of Beyond Cages, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, which highlights the serious issues that carceral strategies pose in the animal protection movement. And he's currently working on a book for Cambridge University Press, also entitled Empirical Animal Law. He is also co-editor with Laurie Gruen of the path-breaking and recent book, Carceral Logics, Human Incarceration and Animal Captivity. His research examines animal law as a powerful case study in progressive carceralism, which he'll speak about more with us today. Justin, welcome to the University of Victoria.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be in your beautiful island, and I've been here since I was very small, and it's a treat to be here with Manisha, who, as I'm sure all of you know, is really one of the global leaders in this field, and so coming to know her work has been kind of one of the joys of joining this field. My talk today is going to be a little bit about the intersection of human rights or civil rights and animal rights or animal law. Does the sound okay for you guys? Is it sound all right? So I thought I would start with just 2 short stories to provide some context for how I think about these issues. And one is personal and one is just an interaction I had last week. So the personal story is a little bit about why I went to law school. I went to law school out of a desire to work in human rights. I would say civil rights, but it really was more human rights, and I was going to do international human rights work. I had that kind of vision of going and championing great causes and doing things and working in The Hague. And by the time I finished law school, I'd been kind of coached into taking a federal clerkship, and I did, and I went and worked for a judge for a year. And by the end of that clerkship, I was absolutely convinced that I didn't need to leave the United States to work on human rights issues, and that there were enough problems within the country. And the one that had attracted my attention in particular during my clerkship was the death penalty. And so I took work as an appellate lawyer doing death penalty cases in the US for a number of years, and still do some of that work pro bono. It's really difficult and challenging and emotional work, but I have this clear memory when I was doing the work full time of both colleagues and friends would come up to me, both at a recess in a case and a weekend over a drink, and they would say things about, why are you vegetarian? And it was always framed in this posture of, how do you care about animals when the state is trying to kill your client next week? And other articulations like this. It was sort of framed, although not explicitly, as, you know, you of all people should know that there are more important things going on in this world than animals, right? They are literally killing people just down the road. And then fast forward to last week when I was talking to a guest from the Middle East, and he was talking about his identity as a vegan. And he said to me that quite often in the last several weeks, people had come to him and said, you know, how do you have the time or the attention or the interest to care about veganism or animals when from your home country and your home region, tens of thousands of people are dying or just died in an earthquake? And he said he'd been reflecting on this question quite a lot. And it reminded me of my time as a death penalty lawyer, because I think both stories raised this sort of similar question, which is, well, if you're doing human rights work, why would you, or are you obligated to care about the animal issue? And there's lots of responses to it, right? I mean, you could say, well, why should my advocacy on behalf of humans facing execution be a barrier to also caring about circus animals or animals in confinement or animals in research? And as this person last week said, well, why or how dare you use the deaths of people and the tragedy to justify your dietary choices, right? Like these two things don't have to be inconsistent. You could care very much about human rights and still you don't have to harm humans, right? And I think that is an important point, which is that, you know, I respect everyone that's doing human rights, but for a lot of fortuity, I would be just doing human rights work. And I don't expect people who are engaged in civil rights or human rights work to be primarily concerned with animal rights. I think that's okay, it's normal, it's good, there's a lot of causes. The problem is that it's false to imagine that a concern for civil rights or human rights is a barrier or inconsistent with being concerned with the plight of non-human animals. And the flip side of that coin is what I'm going to talk about today. And the flip side of that coin, what I mean by that is the other side of the interaction between human rights and animal rights. I also don't think, contrary to what some have accused me of thinking that all animal rights lawyers should fancy themselves human rights lawyers, or that they need to be primarily or most directly concerned with human civil rights. I don't think that's true. But I also think that animal rights advocacy should not harm human rights. I don't think that the animal rights advocacy should come at the expense of humans. I don't think that we should pursue the ends of advancing non-humans in ways that are affirmatively bad for our fellow human beings. So what does that mean, or what does it look like? Well, there's lots of ways this comes up, but where I wanted to focus and what I've written a lot about is the use of carceral law, carceral animal law in particular, to prop up or to protect animals. You know, this is probably based on kind of two types of thinking, and I'll address them both in this talk. The first is that there's something normatively good about pursuing a tough-on-crime approach to animals, animal crimes. There's something good about that, it's morally defensible. And second, that it's good for animals in an instrumental way, that there might be less animal crime, or that animals in general do better if we have a punitive orientation to animal abuse and neglect. And so what I'm going to do today is first talk about what I think of as carceral animal law, just a descriptive case. Like, what do I mean when I say carceral animal law? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why I don't think it serves the interests that we think that it does. That is, namely for this audience, helping animals. And then we'll see where we are with time, but I may end with some of the transformations that the movement, at least in the States, and I see it in Canada too, have made towards what they would say sort of like a more progressive reforms, more fines and fees, and how those are working when it comes to the animal space. So first, what is carceral animal law? It really, by that term, all I mean is this idea that more prosecution is better when it comes to animal crimes, that we could benchmark success based on higher conviction rates, that we could say we're doing well by animals if there are longer sentences, right? Longer criminal sentences for the abusers or the neglectors. Or that we could say, look, as the sort of best-selling US t-shirt in animal law still to this day is, abuse an animal, go to jail. Right? There's a sort of simple through-line logic to it all. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. It's this sort of craving of a solution. It's not unique to animals, right? There's a form of progressive carceralism that has dominated a lot of spheres on the left. In the US, folks have written about progressive carceralism in the domestic violence context. So my friend and colleague Aya Gruber has a book about carceral feminism and the idea that we would achieve greater gender equality through punitive policies. Leah Goodman at the University of Maryland has a book that just came out that's really fantastic about sort of the use of the victims' rights movement as a tool to advance incarceration, human trafficking, interpersonal violence, and how these policies have ended up inflicting more harm on the people they were intended to protect than otherwise. But it's worth spending a few moments just kind of understanding what it has looked like in a unique sense in the animal law field. So what does it mean to be carceral when it comes to animal law? There's lots of examples I could give, and I'm happy to talk more about them in the Q&A. And you're also welcome to just jump in. I will save time for questions, but you should, if something I say is unclear or you're wondering about something, you can jump in and raise your hand, and I'm happy to take a question. But I was going to just say a few things about the unique features of carceral animal law, this sort of punitive orientation. One is the rhetoric, the logics, and the way we talk about helping animals. And the reason I flag this is because in the US in particular, there's a myth that our incarceration problem, that mass incarceration in the US is driven by things like the war on drugs, or that it's driven by, after the books like The New Jim Crow, that it's driven by our reaction to nonviolent crime. But the truth is that has never been true. Those are problematic policies, don't get me wrong, but the reality is that incarceration, racialized incarceration in the US has always been a product of the way we think of solving problems through more prosecution. That if there's something we don't want, we govern through the crime. We try to solve whatever social problems we have through a crime and punishment lens. And so what drives mass incarceration is not punishment of drug crimes or nonviolent crimes, but rather the way that we try to solve all of our problems, right? If you were to sort of take out violent criminals from the US prison system, still be the world leader of incarceration. It's an idea that we could solve complicated problems, from domestic violence to drugs to shootings, through incarceration, often fueled by things like logics of super predators and these types of things. Right? You think about, I don't know if you followed Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, but it was coming up that she had been concerned about these so-called super predators, right? Supposedly violent teens that were going to grow into an uncontrollable force of violence in our communities. Also in this realm, we have the idea and the logics of equalizing down rather than up, right? Rather than bringing animals up to the status of persons or beings, as Manisha would say, we assume that through punishment, animals will just suddenly, poof, have rights. They will be rights holders. They will be more significant in society. And how does that happen? Well, if you read even the briefs of prosecutors and the language of courts, you'll see filings saying things like, he treated his children like animals, or when we want to be punitive towards a person, we would say they're no better than an animal, or they don't deserve any better than a dog, or these things. But even our vocabulary, our way that we come to think about who's deserving of being in the group, in-group, and the out-group, has a sort of like personhood lens attached to it. And there's lots of things I could go through to sort of piece by piece, and I do so in the book Beyond Cages, but kind of like make the case that our thinking here is just deeply punitive, and that's, for various complicated reasons, we have tied ourselves to a logic that says animals will be better off if we are more punitive. Right? We could look at training materials that we provided to judges, we could look at bumper stickers, But the basic point is we have infused society with a rhetoric such that when I go to buy cat food, the person at the cat food store says, "Wait, are you in animal law?" Because I have an animal law program shirt on, and I say, "Oh, I am." And she says, "Oh, I hope they lock those people up," right? There's an intuitive association with incarceration as the problem, the barrier to animals reaching whatever status of welfare or rights we want. But I don't want to suggest that carceral animal law in the US or in Canada has been only or even primarily a rhetorical flourish. It's been really concrete and really damaging in terms of the policies we have undertaken. And I'll give just a couple of examples. I mean, we could walk through this in the Q&A if you're interested, and for those who have studied the sort of history of mass incarceration, you could tick all of the boxes, and the animal movement has been culpable. You think about mandatory minimums, the animal protection groups have pushed for them in the US. You think about higher maximums, the animal protection groups have done so. You think about mandatory arrest or mandatory prosecution, the animal protection groups have done so. So all of these symptoms of a very deeply pathologically hurt and damaged criminal system in the US have been central features of US animal law for decades. But I'll flag just two policies, in part because of their extremity, because of how extreme they are, as illustrative of the depths to which we will travel in order to sort of justify what we think of as an animal rights framework. The two that I'll flag just quickly are immigration enforcement and punishment of children. So in the immigration enforcement context, animal lawyers, right through the publication of my book in 2019, my first book, had filed briefs repeatedly in the US seeking to have persons deported from the country or declarations that persons were automatically entitled to no relief from deportation. So we have this system in the US where you would be deported, but maybe you could seek relief from that. And animal law groups were filing amicus briefs saying, they should be automatically and categorically exempted from any exceptions to deportation. And one case that came out in 2019 that's still on the website of more than one animal group proclaiming animals were recognized as victims, a famous case called Ortega-Lopez involved a US resident who had 3 minor US citizen children. And the federal government had accused this person of what they called, and the federal government, when the Department of Justice says minor, it's truly minor, given their record. And they said he had a minor role in a single cockfighting incident. So you don't have to diminish cockfighting, right? It's a terrible practice, and it's something that I talked to my kids about, and we've actually looked at some stuff about it. But probably, based on the filings, Ortega-Lopez was probably charged as an accomplice. He was probably present at one fight, is the best guess from the filings. So he was present at one fight, and the federal government offered him a probation sentence. But the animal groups came on top of that and demanded that he be deported from the country, that he be removed and categorically treated as exempt from any exceptions to removal. And in fact, as I said, have now used the case and their ultimate victory in that case as a case that stands for the fact that animals can be victims. It's a landmark federal victory, is the headline. Landmark federal victory for animals in recognizing animals as victims of crime. And so if this is the kind of benchmark you're going to use, you can see where it takes you. And again, I'm not saying this is representative. I mean, Ben asked a great question this morning, like, well, how pervasive is this? Is this, is it countrywide? Is it international? Is it... I wouldn't say that every animal lawyer is prioritizing deportation as a way to obtain animal rights. The problem is, if you support this sort of tough on crime approach, this is where the logic has taken some of the best lawyers in the US. It's not that this is all they're doing, or this is the only thing they're doing, or it's the most important thing they're doing, by their own words. But their own logic has led them to support the Trump presidency in seeking to deport more people from the US. It's a logic of defining wins in this way. And the second example that I was going to give, as I already mentioned, is punishing children. And I will just say very little about that other than that a number of groups in the US continue to this day to support a policy of treating juveniles as adults for purposes of animal crimes. And what that means concretely is, for example, in 2018, in a brief filed in Massachusetts, animal groups argued that it wasn't enough that a child, I think he was 16, should be sentenced to potential rehabilitation. They sought that the Massachusetts Supreme Court declare that animal crime made him eligible to be sentenced to adult prison. So they wanted juveniles to be recognized as eligible to go into adult prison. And you can't, I mean, again, it's purely symbolic, right? Because we don't think that the person goes to prison, 16, comes out when they're 17 or 18 and is going to be a kinder, gentler person. Like nobody thinks that that's where you go to learn how to love animals. And so it's all about a symbolic victory in the name of, wow, animals are victims. Look at what we've got. And that's how the briefs read, right? The briefs read about, look, if you did this as a kid and you hurt an adult, we might send you to adult prison, where sexual assault rates are extraordinarily high for kids, by the way. And so if you do that to an animal, it should also be the case. So there's a lot of other examples I could give, but these are just a couple of the types of things which I would call sort of the grotesque flourishes that the logic of punitiveness has justified. Some of the groups try to rein those in now, as I'll talk about at the end, but what scares me about the progressive or carceral posture of animal law is that these things looked okay to us, that we weren't up in arms about it, that we said, oh well, if it's good for animals, then maybe we should do it because we love animals. But that brings me to the next question, right, which is, well, why were we doing it? What did we hope to gain from it? What is the benefit of these policies? Most people who love animals aren't kind of sadistic folks. I mean, there are examples of mass shooters not connecting with humans and just liking animals, but for the most part, we're a group that sort of prides ourselves on empathy and the like. So why this carceral turn? And I think there's a few different explanations for this, right? But I just want to talk about a couple of the most common that I hear. So one, of course, would be deterrence, right? And we're all familiar with the basic idea here, but that is that you would shape the behavior of others, that people would not want to hurt animals because they see that their peers in society are being punished when they hurt animals or neglect animals. The problem with this idea is that when it comes to more punishment leading to less crime, it's really become a pernicious myth to repeat that and say that that's what's going to happen. So the largest meta-analysis of that in the US came out in a University of Chicago Journal of Criminology just last December. And what the authors said is that, quote, it's now a criminological fact that incarceration doesn't reduce crime. So the posture of saying, as long as we keep increasing the punishments, animal crime will go down, had that sort of intuitive appeal, like fifth grade social studies, but it has not held up to any rigorous testing. And when it comes to animal crimes in particular, it's hard to tell a complete story because the data collection is extraordinarily hard. But what I can tell you is that a handful of states, I think there are, it's either 5 or 7 now, it's an odd number. I think it's 7. The 7 states that I've been able to gather data from, and I haven't published on yet, looked at the crime rates just before the enactment of their most recent felony law and just after, and none of those states have a decline in animal crime, right? So if you went from no felony to felony in 2016, or you went from felony that carried 2 years to a felony that carries 10 years, none of those states have seen a drop in animal crime, and in fact, I believe all of them have higher rates of animal crime now than they did at the time. The point isn't that the tougher punishments are leading to more animal crime. I don't think that at all. That would be a preposterous hypothesis, I think. But what we cannot say is that the tougher animal laws, in terms of higher punishments, even private prosecutors, have driven down animal crime. I think there is literally zero data on that, and everywhere I've spoken about, if somebody has a different experience or different data set, and I have never been able to find one. So there is no data that as we became more and more punitive in trying to protect animals, the rates of animal crime went down. So before we jump to that, we would need some data. The other thing I wanted to say about the deterrence point is just that it's a bit of a mismatch with what is happening in terms of animal crime. So what I mean by that is virtually every study of animal crime shows that the majority, and often the vast majority, of the crimes against animals are neglect crimes. That is, crimes of omission, where you haven't sufficiently fed or cared for an animal, they're not the sadistic abuse crimes that we read about in the paper. Yet many of the more serious, or what the animal groups would call upgraded criminal laws, are passed because of or even named for an animal that was abused very terribly, right? So you get a law named Desmond's Law or Libra's Law or something like that, but then it is enforced more against those who are engaged in neglect than abuse, right? That's the way that felony laws work. It doesn't just, you pass a general law and you say, oh, there's this horrible case, and then it turns out that the law is used against those persons always to threaten higher charges, but often we're seeing even the convictions for the sort of named law. So Libra's Law was a law in 2017 passed in Pennsylvania. The dog got to even put his footprint on the bill. It was a big occasion, big celebration. I'm not sure that Libra cared at all. It kind of looked like she wanted to get out of there. But in the years that followed, the vast majority of prosecutions under Libra's Law, Gruber documented this in a chapter in the Carceral Logics book when he noted, in the 3 years after Libra's Law passed, close to 60% of the prosecutions under Libra's Law were for neglect. Right? So it's not the case that we pass these laws to get the serial animal abuser and then that's who's being attacked. It's usually crimes of poverty that end up falling into this. The other thing, probably the second most common rationale that I hear for maintaining a tough on crime approach to animal crime is the opportunity for rehabilitation, to use the traditional penological justification. And you've probably all heard this, which is if you talk to prosecutors, they will say, we just need to get this person help. I don't care if they end up incarcerated, they need to get help. This person is sick, or some version of that. And this is the way to get them government assistance. But if you actually step back and think about that for just a moment, only in a society where we could rationalize caging millions and millions of humans would we think that it is a good way to access government services to prosecute someone and to give them a conviction of record, right? The idea that your gateway to mental health services that otherwise everyone agrees you need or something similar should be conditioned on a criminal conviction is a really perverse rationale. Right? These people may very well need help, but the idea that we should condition them getting help on a criminal conviction is not the kind of logic that I think people who care about animals and care about data would normally push outside of this realm. Right? It's a pretty strange way to think. And for those people who have had a loved one or who worked with people who have been incarcerated or even convicted of crimes, you know what it's like, right? You know what it is like for that person to sit in pretrial detention or to be facing charges, to be risking losing employment, losing relationships. And the idea that stress and that anxiety to get mental health treatment or some other sort of treatment or potentially housing assistance is going to, again, make them better at loving animals is not something we've ever taken seriously. It's not the sort of stimulus or catalyst that is going to turn this person into, a cat lover. And so then, the only other rationale for punishment that I hear frequently in the animal space is one that is a little too complicated to fully unpack today, but it's a logic of incapacitation, and basically that means taking this person off of the street. There's a famous Princeton professor that described it essentially by saying, this guy in prison won't be able to hurt your sister. There's a lot we could say about incapacitation in the animal realm and why it has not worked. But as in other realms, so the animal lawyers have created a kind of logic and a thinking that is at odds and at war with the data. So probably most of you have heard of or thought of this concept called the link, if you've looked at any animal literature, because it's ubiquitous. The idea that persons who harm an animal will go on to hurt people. It's one of those powerful things that legislators want to echo because it allows for a human-centric focus on animal legislation. If we don't protect animals with a more punitive response, then next it's going to be victims. There's a slide actually that I have sometimes that I use of a billboard that's up right now in Connecticut, and Doug had in his presentation that says if you don't protect her now and it has a dog whose nose is all bandaged, it's her next. And then it shows a woman who's badly bandaged. And the truth is that the linked data has never shown anything remotely like that. I would encourage you to look into that. At best, it is wrong 2 out of 3 times, which is the same as the AI programs, the pretrial programs, the other things we're using. Like if you were to use animal harm as a predictor of future violence, you'd be wrong 2 out of 3 times. There are other things that are better predictors that we wouldn't even vastly think we should be looking at those people, like family size, types of parenting, all types of things that are as good or better predictors of future violence than having harmed an animal. It's sort of what one social worker has called the wolf in sheep's clothing, which I think is nice. It sort of really stigmatizes youth and sets them up to look like they're going to be serial killers, but in reality, many of them are just fortunately engaging in behavior that is normatively acceptable among their peer group, grossly acceptable, right? Something that we should intervene about, but it's not a good predictor of crime down the road. The other thing to say about incapacitation is that the research, and this is out of the US, tends to show that the longer someone is incarcerated, each year that they are incarcerated, their likelihood of reoffending goes up about 4 to 7%. And so why that's relevant is that if you think that you should incarcerate someone for a longer time, we end up chasing our tail, because the longer you incarcerate a person, the more likely it is that they are to reoffend. And that's not even accounting for sort of generational impacts on the community of having someone taken out. So it's really not a good assumption that you can just sort of remove this person and then animals will be safe. And the other thing I'll say, particularly because in the US, in a number of states, we have this kind of shift towards once again, towards a tough on crime approach is becoming more popular as a political slogan. I think it will be in the next presidential election. Is if we think that 1 year is better than 6 months incarceration for animals, then why not 2 years? And if 2 years, why not 10 years? Like what would be the line that you would draw? And right now in Florida, there is a governor named Ron DeSantis. And he is, keen to be viewed as a contender for the Republican nomination in the U.S. against Donald Trump. And Ron DeSantis is doing a number of interesting things in stoking a cultural war. But one of them is he has vowed to bring back the death penalty for non-homicide crimes. So currently in the U.S., you can only get the death penalty if you engage in homicide. And Ron DeSantis says he thinks that he has a majority of the Supreme Court that would disagree, and that we could get the death penalty for non-homicide crimes. Now, the list that he has that he would like to extend it to doesn't include animals right now. But why shouldn't it, right? Like, if the ultimate victory is having animals declared victims for incapacitation purposes, and we're willing to push for deportation or children be punished, why not add animals? Like, wouldn't that be the ultimate victory for animals if you believe in this logic, which is that Ron DeSantis should say you could execute a person who tortures and abuses an animal? I think everyone would say no, or I don't think so, but I'm not sure that's true of the animal lawyers writ large. And that's the problem with incapacitation, is figuring out these limits. So I want to sort of now turn to saying, okay, if you're with me so far, then you understand basically what animal lawyers have done, which is create a field that is punitive animal law, carceral animal law. And you would also, if you're with me, say it's not always for the good. That is to say, it's not clear that it's deterring animal crime, driving it down. It's not clear that we are producing a more loving society that's ready to be kind to animals. But the skeptic in the room, I think, would wisely say, okay, sure, but at the very least, it's not hurting animals, right? Like, we can try more than one thing at a time, and if this isn't a particularly good method, then we can do this while we also do something else, and that will be great. And I would say that that is a dangerous line of thought, and I'll just offer a few thoughts on that, and then I'll give you a couple of closing thoughts and take questions. The first reason I think that it's not a harmless sideshow, that it's the punitive animal approach, is financial. The animal movement does not have unlimited resources at all, and when we invest our limited lobbying and financial resources to prioritize things like felony laws, we miss other things. It's just there is a zero-sum game when it comes to animal lawyering. The number of lawyers who are right now devoted to running prosecutor trainings and having longer sentences is really vast. The amount of resources spent in the carceral animal law field is enormous. So we are losing something. Right? Second, I have argued that this kind of animal law is a sort of palliative. And what I mean by that is it serves as a distraction. It's a displacement that if I was an animal agricultural proponent, I wanted more factory farms, and I was sitting on an agricultural committee in a state legislature or a provincial body, there's nothing I would like more than for the animal advocates from the big organizations to focus everyone's attention on felony laws about dogs and cats that don't even reach farm animals. Create all of this sound and fury over here, and then the animals that are suffering the most are completely ignored. Right? It is an amazing distraction technique, and yet we have played directly into it. I have watched a state legislator in my home state of Colorado who has told me that he always eats pig during the committee meetings when he knows that I'm going to testify because he hopes that it will upset me. And you know, I mean, it doesn't particularly upset me. I have lots of family members that eat animals, but he's that kind of a personality. And when there was a bill recently to increase the penalties in Colorado for animal abuse, he had just the smuggest, happiest look because that was the only animal bill that was going to come before his committee the entire year. And I thought, man, he must feel so happy right now that like nothing will ever come for the sheep industry in Colorado, or the pigs, or the other things, right? And I wrote in this paper called Palliative Animal Law, I said, quote, like other palliative treatments, the carceral agenda provides pain relief for the humans that are disturbed by the animal violence, but it masks rather than cures the structural violence involved in ordinary commercial or exploitation of animals, right? Like it is not solving the problems we think. The other problem that I wanted to focus on just briefly with this, the reason that I think it hurts the movement is that it feeds into what Corey Lee Wren, a UK sociologist and scholar, has called the non-profit industrial complex. The movement has been co-opted in some ways by this desire to be mainstream or to be non-threatening, to be non-radical. Like we want as animal people to be accepted on a faculty or be viewed as normal among our peers. And what's normal among our peers is criminal law. Like what is better than bread and butter and criminal prosecution? Who could be against the Department of Justice? And so if we, in our effort to be normal and to be mainstream, we have sold out to an agenda that is really punitive and has all of these race and class problems. And so, I'm having to talk about the Q&A, but that's why at the University of Denver, we have started a clinic that is the other side, which is focused on defending persons who are facing criminal prosecution for their activism in the animal sphere, right? So that's one of the things that's really interesting is the animal protection groups in the US have spent enormous amounts, millions of dollars a year, on lobbying and lawyering to create relationships with prosecutors. This is not disputed. But when an activist is facing prosecution in one of those jurisdictions, the very lawyers who they are working with to prosecute somebody for hurting a dog or neglecting a cat will bring a domestic terrorism charge or a charge of trespass and burglary for having rescued an animal. And the animal groups act helpless in being able to pressure them to not bring the prosecution. It's an amazing disconnect. We have spent millions of dollars building relationships with prosecutor offices, but the prosecutor offices have no allegiance to us when an activist is facing incarceration. And I think you know that well in Canada here too, even in BC. So there are lots of other problems that could be identified, but the last one I'll mention is that the focus on criminal law is really radically alienating for a movement that wants to align with other progressive social change organizations. And I say that, I can tell lots of stories about this, but occasionally I have been to a state where they were passing an ag law, and I've been trying to get civil society groups to join in amicus briefs or legislative testimony. And they will say, well, the animal people are all racist. And I'll say, what do you mean? And they'll talk about anti-immigration efforts they've had. They'll talk about how they lobby against a factory farm by saying you're going to have your communities filled with people from Africa, which is what a lobbyist in Idaho told me. He said that they lobbied against the dairy by scaring the people about where the workforce would come from. And so these groups say, we don't have anything in common with you, right? Like we don't see the connection. And I would add to that even if we haven't said things that are overtly offensive, the communities that we want to work with are put off by the idea that stronger police reactions, more prosecutions, and harsher sentences are a path towards justice. It's very alienating for many of those communities. And so I have a set of research on this that's based on national representative U.S. Polling that I have done. I haven't published yet, but this probably won't come as a surprise to most of you, but I thought I would share some of this demographic information that I'm using in a book I'm working on. The first fact is that in the U.S., persons who make less than $100,000 are more than 4 times as likely than others to know someone who's been accused of animal abuse or neglect. So, I mean, when I put that graph up, the income variable is just shocking, right? I mean, not shocking because you'd probably predict it, but it is so vast, right? Like if you make 100,000, it's very unlikely you know a neighbor or a friend or a relative who's been accused. If you make less than that, it jumps up. And the lower you go on the income, less than 50,000 in the US is the highest rate. The other thing I'll say is that for persons who identify as in the US, the sample size, I should say up front, didn't include enough persons who identified as indigenous to be able to draw any conclusions about that. But for persons who identified as Black or Latinx, they were always, across these national representative samples, didn't matter if it was rural or urban, 2 times more likely to know someone who had been accused of an animal-related crime. And so that's pretty striking, right? And again, these aren't conclusive numbers because the data is very, very hard to compile from the traditional sources, but that should give us pause. It should at least say, wow, I don't know what to do with that. I'll also say that the only nationally compiled data source is the FBI data in the US. And there's lots of gaps in it, there's lots of holes in it. People still use it for reasons to up the punishment. So I'll just quickly tell you one thing that I found from that, which is if you've read or even heard of the new Jim Crow, you know that one of Michelle Alexander's premises is that there are a set of crimes for which persons of color are overcharged and over-arrested relative to their presence in the population. That is that, for example, Black persons in the United States are grossly overrepresented when it comes to charging for vagrancy or public drunkenness or false checks. There's a whole list of crimes that she has some things to say about. And what I did is I took the animal crimes in the US, which were only tracked by the FBI since 2016, and I compared the arrest and the charging rate for those crimes to the crimes that are quintessentially viewed as the new Jim Crow crimes in the US. And the animal crimes fit uncomfortably within the same percentages. They're not the top and they're not the lowest, right? Some of I think it's vagrancy is charged around 30% of the persons are persons of color in the US according to the FBI data. But other crimes like public intoxication, it's around 20, 25, and that's right where the animal crime falls. Like I think the animal crimes according to the FBI data, around 25% of the persons, 22 to 25% depending on the year, are persons who identify as Black. So I'm not making any sweeping claims here because we don't have the data to do so, but I do want to say that there is a problem, and it's a sort of NIMBYism when it comes to progressive carceralism, which is that many of us accept that the criminal system in other areas is broken and needs to go, but when it comes to animal law, we would accept it and say, well, it's really bad, but we've got to do something for the animals, so we should still tolerate it. And I would say there's no proof that it's helping, and there's a lot of proof that it is hurting. And so I'll end and turn it to questions just I'll just give you one story that I wrote about I've been doing a bit of qualitative research because the number data is lean, the quantitative data is lean. So what happened after I published Beyond Cages is that a number of the groups said, well, I mean, there's maybe a problem with the criminal system, but most of the time we are now shifting, and we're going to just look at cases where we're usually giving probation. We're just trying to get the person help through a fine, maybe some restitution orders. We just need to get them a conviction of record and get them into the system. And I want to tell a story about a case that I came across while doing this research for my last book that I think shows the problem with even imagining criminal enforcement as a net good. So there was a woman that lived in Texas, and she had a Maltese dog. And everyone agreed that she loved this Maltese dog. There wasn't some claim of sinister poisoning or that she wanted the dog to suffer. Everyone agreed that it was a close and dear family member. The dog started to limp when she got older, and so Maria brought the dog into a veterinarian, and the veterinarian said, "Oh my gosh, I see what's happened. As is common with Maltese dogs, she has some terrible matting on her underside, and it's caused some tissue damage." So I guess this is something that happens. Like it started just kind of from a hygiene issue, but it had become a medical issue. And she said, "Okay, well, how much does it cost?" And the vet said, it'll be about $1,500 to $2,000 to take care of this animal. Now, again, we might imagine what you could do with the millions of dollars we invest in prosecutors if there was a vet fund for persons. But this woman, Maria, again, undisputed on the record, prosecutors undisputed, could not afford $1,500 for her dog. She could not afford it. So she had a couple of choices. She made the choice to bring the dog home and, by her own words, hope that the dog got better over the next couple weeks. Dog came home, slept, had a pretty good life, was still jumping up on the bed, still living with Maria. But after a couple weeks, by Maria's assessment, she was doing less well. She said it seemed like she was moving less and it was not getting better. And so Maria, following the advice of a friend who had said, "Oh, well, the local animal shelter says we will take all animals, we'll give them the proper vet care and make sure they find a safe home." So here's this sort of classist thing where only persons of a certain income can have their animals and keep their pets. But she said, through tears, okay, this is the right thing to do for Muffy because Muffy will get the vet care. And so she surrendered her dog to the local animal shelter over tears. Everyone, again, agrees that she loved the dog. Everyone agrees that she sought the medical care. And everyone agrees that she was only surrendering the dog because she couldn't afford the care that the dog needed. There's a thing that is very popular in the US, and now in Canada I've seen it on a number of the lists, and it seems so uncontroversial, which is mandatory reporting, right? Which means social workers, vets, all these people who see a child who's injured, well, of course you should go to the authorities and tell them because we want this harm to stop. So guess what happened when Maria brought her dog, who had matting, to this shelter? Sad. The veterinarian called the police. They called the Dallas police and said, "We think we have had neglect here." And within 2 days, police officers arrested Maria and charged her with what had recently been, according to the rankings for the animal law groups in the country, an upgrade to the Texas criminal law, made the felony neglect in Texas a 10-year felony. So Maria was arrested and charged with felony neglect and faced 10 years in prison. She could not make bail, so her minor child was left with, and her husband were left to tend for the kid without her. She spent, I think it was just under 60 days in pretrial detention, so still technically innocent. And then, right, this is why the statistics won't ever even tell the full story. Her case was dismissed. So the prosecutor said, well, as long as you agree not to have any more animals, we will allow you to go. She's lost her job at this point. Her family is in turmoil. This case doesn't even show up in the statistics if we're supposed to gather it. But guess what happened on the day she was going to be released? She didn't just go home. She didn't get released to her husband. Immigration and Customs Enforcement came and got her and moved her to an immigration detention center. So this woman, who by many playbooks had not done anything wrong, and no one thought she wanted to harm an animal, was moved to an ICE detention center, along with many others, in 2020. And this is a case that we wouldn't even count in the statistics for kind of carceral animal law because it was a case where her case was dismissed, right? So it's a great outcome. The point is, interventions in the criminal system for the persons who are exposed to it are bad. They don't work out well very often. And so part of what I want persons in the animal protection movement to do is move beyond the myth that it's not particularly terrible for persons if they don't get sentenced to prison, or it's only a fine. And I'm going to stop there, but I'll just say the other narrative that I was going to share with you is from a woman who was living on Social Security, and police officers went door to door in that community, a low-income community, to see if people had their vaccine records or see if dogs were tethered. Right? So we used to talk about in Colorado, before we legalized marijuana, we used to talk about the burnt weed smell as like sort of like the probable cause. Police would just walk around apartments and be like, yep, it smells some weed, let's get in there, if they wanted to intervene on something. But now it really could be the barking dog. Right? Like if you hear a dog and you say, oh, I think that dog sounds sad, I'm going to bust down this door, I'm going to get in there. And in fact, that's what we argue for. It's an invitation for police into the lives of these people's homes. And in this case that I was going to tell you about, police went door to door checking vaccine records. I've never had vaccine records. I mean, I'm sure I should have had them at some point. And if you didn't have them, you would get a fine. You say, well, fine, it's not so bad. But for many of these people who are living on the margins, the fine ends up resulting in their incarceration because they miss a court date or they miss a payment. And so in many states, like it's, very high percentages of persons in local jails and prisons are there for the failure to comply with something that was other than an imprisonment sentence. And so I have a lot of stories of sort of police going door to door, police finding a dog that was tethered and issuing a citation, police finding a dog that got out of the fence and said, well, we already gave you a warning, so this time you have to get a citation. All of these things contribute to a general sense of what carceral animal law is. And I would just say, I don't think any of these cases represent a victory for animals, right? It would be very hard to take these cases and say, oh, but yeah, it's tough what happened to Maria, but gosh, I'm glad we're doing so much for animals, right? That's not what happened. And it did not happen to Muffy. But in the other two cases I was going to tell you about, both of the dogs were euthanized, right? So they took them from somebody who loved them, the person eventually ended up incarcerated, and the dog is dead, right? So there's no happy ending at all in those stories. So with that, I will take some questions, but thank you for your patience.
Have a brief few minutes for questions. We should probably take one or two.
I really like the point you brought up about how the prosecutors will not take the side of the activists when it comes to them crossing into a property that belongs to meat production or
right.
meat production or whatever. Because one of my main concerns ever since I started law school was ag laws and how we are very disjointed from the idea that we are very abusive to animals, just not the animals that we particularly think of like dogs and cats, but our legislators very much sanction this industry that harms millions and millions and millions of animals every year.
Yes.
So what is how, I don't obviously the carceral route I'm doing is not helpful, but what do you see in the future would be the most helpful to it's hard to attack the meat industry and the dairy industry in this way because it is such an integral part of
right.
Canadian culture, but something like ag laws that protect even whistleblowers from bringing attention to these terrible abuses that are happening, just to put meat on our table, what step can we take in that respect?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I often, it's the luxury of being an academic. I don't have all these answers. I mean, what I would say is that I'm hopeful that the next generation of lawyers will have the foresight, like yourself, to say, we're not satisfied with a law that says, you can go to prison for 10 years for abusing a dog or cat. And part of it is just going to the groups and the NGOs and the legislators and saying, this isn't really what animal law is, or it should be, right? I mean, the ranking system in the U.S. Moved Iowa up and congratulated Iowa, the largest pork producer in the U.S. last year. They went up on factory farming, while they passed a new ag law. And you say, well, how could that be? because the ranking metrics benefited them for having increased the penalties for their felony animal abuse. And so, I mean, there is a way to raise legislative awareness by saying, look, we don't accept those rankings, and you create your own ranking system, or you work with the NGOs to reframe them. And I think the Iowa sponsor of the new felony bill said, we're doing this in order to improve our rankings. We don't want Iowa to be at the bottom of the list. And I think that well, then don't pass an ag gag law, right? But they thought that they could do something else. They could actually use the animal law rankings to sort of like shield themselves. So I don't know, Manisha is a much better scholar than me on like kind of the things that work in social change. I will just say, my view is it's going to come from like making sure we don't have this tunnel vision, and that we like any bill that says, oh, this is an animal protection bill, we shouldn't go out and protest in favor of it and jump on the bandwagon just because it happens to be what someone in the hierarchy is telling us is pro-animal. Like to question it and say, well, what exactly does this do for animals? How does this advance the larger spectrum of animal rights? But I appreciate the question.
But I just like grappled with a lot because animal
Yeah.
abuse and like the meat industry is a huge issue, but the cost of food and meat itself is rising so much that like forcing these companies to like implement regulations or whatever that won't harm these animals will ultimately drive up the cost to the consumer. So
Totally.
ultimately, I just think it's a capitalist problem.
That's probably
because
right.
people are just profiting and putting the cost
Totally.
and the moral dilemma on the consumer.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's, yeah,
One
please.
question?
Sorry.
Thank you so much,
Oh,
Justin.
yeah, thank you, Jen.
I guess I would just ask, like I teach a class on crime and deviance and we talk about these issues a lot. And I think, we don't talk specifically about animal issues, but we talk about incarceration in general and just the way forward. And when we talk about things like defunding the police or abolishing prisons, you get a lot of students who are like, okay, but then like what do we do, right? Like
Yeah.
it's that automatic question of like, okay, so what is the way forward then? If we're not actually like quote unquote punishing people for their behavior, right?
Right.
And so wondering what you would say to that sort of question in terms of, so then what do we do moving forward instead?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I try to go to those. Every 3 years I teach a similar class in our sociology department. I don't know. I'd be interested in what you think, Taylor. I'll say this. What I often say is, so far we haven't tried anything, right? And the animal movement could be a place where we try something, and it could lead to radical change. So, with the social workers school, I am piloting like 3 studies where we're going to look in Uganda, hopefully one in Canada, maybe in Ontario, and one in Colorado, where the people are going to have access to the restorative or kind of like an empathy training at a farm sanctuary, and the prosecutors are going to agree to just divert a random section of cases. I feel very confident that the rate of animal crime recidivism is not going to be higher among those people. And so part of it, this data if you're teaching the class, you take some comfort in the fact that I think if we did nothing, like we just like dropped the charges, not like diversion, not like crime light, but just like push the person out of the system, more often than not, we probably would be less likely to see that person than if they went on probation or if they went on something else. And so, I take some comfort in the fact that when people say, well, what is your alternative? Honestly, probably doing nothing would not increase animal crime. And so when we start to try things, I expect the benefits will be even better, right? Like if somebody isn't like scared of not being able to pay their fine or scared of the probation officer coming to their house, but instead has to go to a sanctuary, a couple of times and go on the tour and talk to these people, like, is that going to make the person perfect? No. Is it like somewhat paternalistic? Yes. Are there problems? Yes. But is it better than saying, okay, we have to have a conviction or? And so I'm quite open to like any radical alternatives. Like I said, the social work school was interested in engaging with us in some like directed empathy trainings. But I do always take umbrage with the idea that like until we have a perfect solution in place, we shouldn't do anything, because it's not like this system is working, right? Like I said, like every state that I have measured, animal crimes have gone up. Well, we have become more punitive. And so we can't be like, well, if we cut back, things are going to get worse. It's a separate debate, as you know, Patrick Sharkey, with like cutting back on police. If we didn't have police, we could have that argument, but it's definitely not the case if we stopped punishing people.
Thank you.
We're going to have to leave the question.
I'm happy to take more questions up front. I'm sorry for taking them. Yeah, please come up.
I just want to thank you for the thought-provoking, but also very well-structured and ultimately compelling talk. And really want to acknowledge how difficult, I think all of us appreciate it is to take kind of an unpopular position.
Thank you.
And in our communities of scholarship or advocacy or even friendship and family, and to bring it into conversation in such a thoughtful way as you have done with this work. So really want to
Thank you,
that
Alicia.
public impact and
This
scholarly
way.
impact.
This way.
Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thank you. Thank you. And please do come up. I'm happy to take questions and stuff. Please don't be shy.